This week, as we finish our look at the Genesis flood, we'll begin with the fossils again, and we'll see how one more piece of fossil evidence and the Genesis flood are connected. As we learned last week, many different petrified fossils help us answer the question, was the Genesis flood literally global? But this week we'll look at one more particular feature of some of those fossils. This time, our investigation into the fossil record will involve dinosaurs and a very strange pose they often display, which has defied scientific explanation for a very long time until recently. The pose is called the opisthotic death pose, and it's characterized by the head and the neck of the dinosaur being unnaturally arched backwards. Sometimes the tail is arched upwards as well. Here, in these two images, we can see what this theropod dinosaur might have looked like when it was alive. And then we can see what its fossil looked like when it was found. Clearly, that position was not a normal posture for the Ornithomimus, and most paleontologists would now agree that the death pose of this dinosaur fossil tells us something important about how it died and came into contact with sediment-laden water, which is required to form a fossil like this. We know from observing other animals that this neck position is not natural, so it can give us some insight into how this creature's life ended. And even more than that, this posture should tell us something about how many of the dinosaurs ended their time on Earth, because in sedimentary layers all over the world, we find vast numbers of many varieties of dinosaurs have been fossilized in this same bizarre pose. Understanding the death pose of these amazing fossils can help us understand what circumstances were involved in their death. And the answer should be consistent with the conditions that form sedimentary rocks also, since they are always found in that specific type of formation. Sure enough, the common denominator between the death pose of these dinosaurs and the sedimentary rocks they're found in is water, and lots of it. In The New Scientist, Brian Switek writes, recreating the spectacular pose many dinosaurs adopted in death might involve following the simplest of instructions, which are, just add water. He adds, when paleontologists are lucky enough to find a complete dinosaur skeleton, there's a good chance it will be found with its head thrown backwards and its tail arched upwards. He also writes, no one is entirely sure why this posture is so common, but Alicia Cutler and colleagues from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, think it all comes down to a dip in the wet stuff. I should also add that since the time of this article, other paleontologists have duplicated the experiment we're about to read about, and they are now in full agreement that water is the key to this puzzle. The experiment that's convincing paleontologists these days goes something like this. Cutler placed plucked chickens, both fresh and frozen, on a bed of sand for 3 months to see if desiccation would lead to muscle contractions that pulled the neck upwards, a previously suggested explanation for the death pose. But the chickens decayed without contorting. However, when 7 other chickens were placed into cool, fresh water, their necks arched and their heads were thrown back within seconds. Sustained immersion of the birds for up to a month slightly increased the severity of the pose, but the major movement of the head occurred almost immediately, they reported. So, not only are these dinosaurs buried in water-laden sediments to be fossilized, we can also see water was involved in how they died also, as proven by their arching neck. Here's a brief video that shows a different paleontologist reproducing Alicia Cutler's discovery. So, we now know that water made these air-breathing, land-dwelling dinosaurs contort when they died in a massive flood, and that water also later buried them in sediments and facilitated their fossilization. And since we find these bizarre death poses all over the globe, we can see that they were all involved in a flood on a global scale. So, even the pose of many dinosaur fossils found all over the world is pointing to a watery death and a burial in a global catastrophic flood. Our final look at the evidence for the global nature of the flood will involve the field of science called anthropology. An anthropologist uses all of the sciences together to aid in the study of humans and their cultures in the past and in the present. So, the question you might be asking now is, why should we turn to anthropology for evidence of a global flood? And to answer that question, I would then ask, if every human on earth was directly descended from Noah and his family, what would we expect to find in the various cultures from all around the world? The answer to that question is flood accounts and stories. That's because if a global flood truly did occur, and all cultures on earth today have truly descended from Noah, then we should expect to see an account of that great flood in many diverse cultures. And guess what? That's exactly what we find, and we'll even see an example. But before we see that example, we'll start by reviewing the details of the most plausible and reliable account of the flood when impartially analyzed, and that's the Bible. In our first specific detail, the Bible tells us the reason for the great catastrophe was the wickedness, corruption, and violence that was present on the earth. The Bible also tells us that the flood was a divine judgment sent by God when it records, "The Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." Then the Bible's clear that Noah's family was favored by God to be saved from the judgment of the flood by saying, "Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, and Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then the Bible states plainly that Noah was forewarned about this coming judgment by God. As the Lord said, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with all the earth." And in the biblical account, God specifically instructed Noah to build an ark, and even gave him details about its length, width, height, materials, construction, windows, decks, and door. The Bible also tells us that all flesh that moved on the earth died because it was destroyed by the water. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died because of the waters. And we see in the Scriptures that the flood was global in extent, and all of the high hills under the whole heaven were covered, including every mountain. Also, only Noah's family on the ark, which was 8 people in all, survived. But all other living things that were on the face of the ground before the flood were destroyed from the earth. And only the air-breathing animals on the ark who were with Noah and his family survived through the flood along with them. All other animals outside the ark, with the breath of life in their nostrils, died. As the flood waters receded, the Bible records that the ark then came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the month and the day are recorded for us too. The Bible then recounts that Noah sent out birds from the ark to look for dry ground. And at first, the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. So she returned into the ark to Noah, since the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. The Bible also tells us that Noah built an altar to the Lord and offered clean animal sacrifices to the Lord with burnt offerings. And God made a covenant with the earth and its inhabitants and signified that covenant with the rainbow. So from these passages, we should note what we saw. Wickedness was the cause of a divine judgment, but God favored a specific family and forewarned them of his coming judgment. God also instructed his favored man to build an ark, to prepare for the coming destruction by water that took the form of a global flood. So only Noah and his family survived, along with the animals that were with them on the ark. And the ark landed on a mountain. Birds were sent from the ark, and later sacrifices and a rainbow were mentioned. These are the key details from the Genesis account of the flood that we need to note very carefully. One remarkable account of creation and the flood that closely matches the account in Genesis has been handed down from generation to generation among the Mao tribespeople who live in the mountains of southwest China. When missionary Ernest Trau began to work with this isolated group, to his surprise, they already knew much of the history recorded in Genesis, and they knew it before any missionary or Bible had ever been introduced to them. What follows is Ernest's translation of their ancient traditional song that was handed down to them from generation to generation. On the day God created the heavens and the earth, on that day he opened the gateway of light. In the earth then he made heaps of earth and of stone. In the sky he made bodies, the sun and the moon. In the earth he created the hawk and the kite. In the water created the lobster and fish. In the wilderness made he the tiger and the bear. Made verdure to cover the mountains. Made forest extend with the ranges. Made the light cane green. Made the rank bamboo. On the earth he created a man from the dirt. Of the man thus created, a woman he formed. Then the patriarch Dirt made a balance of stones, estimated the weight of the earth to the bottom, calculated the bulk of the heavenly bodies, and pondered the ways of the deity God. The patriarch Dirt begat patriarch Sete. The patriarch Sete begot a son, Lusu. And Lusu had Gehlo, and he begot Lamah. And the patriarch Lamah begot the man Nuah. His wife was the matriarch Ga-Bolin. Their sons were Lohan, Loshen, and Jahu. So the earth began filling with tribes and with families. Creation was shared by the clans and the peoples. These did not God's will, nor returned his affection, but fought with each other, defying the Godhead. Their leaders shook fists in the face of the mighty. Then the earth was convulsed to the depths of 3 strata, rending the air to the uttermost heaven. God's anger arose till his being was changed. His wrath, flaring up, filled his eyes and face, until he must come and demolish humanity, come and destroy a whole world full of people. So it poured 40 days in sheets and in torrents, then 55 days of misting and drizzle. The waters surmounted the mountains and ranges. The deluge ascending leapt valley and hollow. An earth with no earth upon which to take refuge, a world with no foothold where one might subsist. The people were baffled, impotent, and ruined, despairing, horror-stricken, diminished, and finished. But the patriarch Noah was righteous, the matriarch Ga-Bolin upright, built a boat very wide, made a ship very vast. Their household entire got aboard and were floated. The family complete rode the deluge in safety. The animals with him were female and male. The birds went along and were mated in pairs. When the time was fulfilled, God commanded the waters. The day had arrived. The flood waters receded. Then Noah liberated a dove from their refuge, sent a bird to go forth and bring again tidings. The flood had gone down into lake and to ocean, and the mud was confined to the pools and the hollows. There was land once again where man might reside. There was a place in the earth now to rear habitations. Buffalo then were brought in oblation to God. Fatter cattle became sacrificed to the mighty. The Divine One then gave them his blessings. Their God then bestowed his good graces. The song then goes on to describe Babel and the confusion of languages also. And all of this was found in a culture that had no access to the Bible and no previous missionary contact. Obviously, their ancestors taught them these amazing verses, and they sang these traditional songs at weddings and funerals to remind their people of their ancestry. It's important to note, not only does their account sound very similar to the Bible, with some of the same sounding names, their flood story even has the same context that the Bible contains, with the creation, a rebellion, a flood, and later a confusion that very closely matches the Babel account. And the creation begins on day one, just as it does in the Bible. God created the heavens and the earth on the first day. And light was introduced in their traditional story on day one, just as it was in the Bible. Then God made dry land and the sun and the moon with the stars. And he created the animals and plants to cover the earth. Then, after the animals, in a way very similar to the Bible, they recorded that God made man from the dust, or the dirt, and from the man, God formed woman. And they even traced the lineage from dirt, or Adam as we know him, to Lamah, which is very similar to Lamech, and his son Noah, which is very similar to Noah. But just as the Bible recorded, wickedness in the people prevailed, and they fought with each other, which arose God to anger. Then God decided to destroy all of humanity and the whole world that was full of people. So it rained 40 days and 40 nights, just as it did in the Bible. And the waters rose above the mountains until there was no earth to stand on. All the people were lost, but Noah, who was counted as righteous, and his entire household. Because they built a vast ship, they survived the flood in safety. And along with Noah and his family, the animals, male and female, along with the birds, were kept safely on the ark. And Noah sent out birds to look for dry land, and when the waters receded, the land reappeared. And Noah made sacrifices to God from the cattle, and God gave them a blessing and bestowed on them his good graces. There are even more details that match up than just our list here, but we definitely saw wickedness was the cause for the divine judgment, but a favored righteous family was spared. They built a vast ship, and the world was destroyed by water in a global flood, so that only the family on the ark survived, along with the animals that were with them. Also, birds were sent from the ark, and sacrifices were made to God. Only 3 of our key ingredients were missing from this ancient flood account, and there are other similarities, such as 3 sons, the name of Noah, and so on, that are not listed here. But clearly, these are describing the same event in history. But here's the amazing thing. This one example we just studied is only one of many flood legends. Apologetics Press writes, anthropologists who study legends and folktales from different geographical locations and cultures consistently have reported one particular group of legends that is common to practically every civilization. Legends have surfaced in hundreds of cultures throughout the world that tell of a huge, catastrophic flood that destroyed most of mankind and that was survived by only a few individuals and animals. They also write, although most historians who have studied this matter estimate that these legends number into the 200s, according to evolutionary geologist Robert Schoch, Noah is but one tale in a worldwide collection of at least 500 flood myths, which are the most widespread of all ancient myths and therefore can be considered among the oldest. Schoch went on to observe narratives of a massive inundation are found all over the world. Stories of a great deluge are found on every inhabited continent and among a great many different language and culture groups. When compared, those flood stories from around the globe have remarkable similarities that point back to a real historical event that must have been burned into the memory of the cultures that descended from that family that was saved. Next to each detail of the Genesis account, we see the percentage of the many flood legends that contain that same detail, and there are even more similarities that couldn't be listed here as we saw in our example. So what this tells us is that in terms of a worldwide cultural memory, the two clearest details preserved throughout history about the flood was that it destroyed the earth by water and it was truly a global flood. These independent, traditional, and cultural stories all reflect details that match the Genesis account, and the overwhelming majority of them testify that the flood was indeed global, and its impact on our world is evident all around us. We have clearly seen that theology, logic, geology, paleontology, and anthropology all confirm a global flood, and we have undeniable reasons to rely on the Bible's account of the global flood in Genesis.